Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Growth Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Dixon, and today we've got Louisa Plint on the podcast. She is the founder and CEO of Auxeris. Auxeris is a tech platform that is supporting the recruitment industry, and we go into how she works with recruiters and how she supports them, especially recruiting firms that are very small, 1 to 5 people shops, providing business development resources, back office support, etc. This is a space that I know quite well, given that I have my own recruiting and executive search business. So we dive a little bit deep into some of the recruiting space, but we talk a lot more about how she expanded this business, what her expansion plans are, being that she is based in the UK and wanting to expand into the US and Canada. So great episode. And so let's get Louisa on the pod. Interested in hearing conversations with private equity leaders, CEOs of private equity-backed companies, and startup entrepreneurs where they share their stories about their career journeys, starting, investing in, and scaling successful businesses, and the important role that having the right talent plays in building a successful business, then you are in the right place. Welcome back to another episode of the Growth Capital Podcast. Here's your host, Justin Dixon. Louisa, thank you for being on the podcast.
I'm very glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's jump right in. You and I know each other a little bit, but for the audience that may not know who you are, tell me a little bit about yourself and what you're up to right now and where you're located.
Yeah, of course. So I'm Louisa Plint. I run a company called Auxeris, which is a tech platform in the recruitment space. So designed to sort of democratize the insanity that is the recruitment industry through providing technology to the little fish in the industry. I'm based in London primarily, though currently I'm sitting in snowy Sweden. But yeah, normally based in South London. And yeah, that's kind of pretty much me. Work-life balance is terrible.
Yeah, well, any kind of entrepreneur, I call it like a work-life integration. There's always this kind of like people talk about balance, and I don't know if there is really a balance between work and life, whether you're an entrepreneur or a W-2 kind of employee. It just kind of all meshes together at some point. Well, I guess how did you kind of get into this kind of world, right? Where did you start your career in recruitment? Maybe walk us through a little bit of your journey before starting Auxeris.
Of course, yeah. So I always knew I wanted to run something. I started my first business when I was 20 at university. I mean, before that, I was selling bacon sandwiches when I was 14. I was always interested in people. I studied anthropology at university, having bailed on the idea of doing engineering. And so recruitment sort of was something that I was around a lot, but never from a career perspective, always as a candidate or a client. And then my father, when I was in my teens, said to me, if there's an industry you're looking to go into, look at 15% of that market, because that's your best case scenario. And if that number doesn't make you feel sick, don't do it. And having worked out that the recruitment industry was incredibly slow and clunky, I then looked at the size of the market, and 15% of $650 billion a year sort of made me feel sick. And I thought, I know there's a problem. I know there's work to be done, and there's a valuable enough resource. There's a pot of gold at the end of it that's worth hunting as well. And so, yeah, really started looking at how the market was structured, and just realized that the vast majority of the industry is just one-man bands and tiny companies, and they are dramatically underserved. And so it seemed like an honourable problem to solve as well, because it affects everybody. And I never wanted to do anything that sort of undermined my somewhat consistent moral compass. And so, yeah, it seemed like a big enough opportunity.
And how long ago did you start Auxeris?
So it's sort of a grey area. I started in the recruitment space in 2018. So I set up as an independent recruiter, building a business called Doer, which was kind of the predicator to Auxeris, because it was quite arrogant of me to think I could go into an industry I'd never worked in. And I was actually looking to launch the business in America we were negotiating with a VC in January, February 2020. And luckily dodged a bullet, didn't close the round, and sort of put a hold on it when COVID came around. And then, so we sort of relaunched the new iteration of it in January 22 after raising a small friends and family round. But of course, I'd done all the kind of prep work and research, and we've been sort of from a sort of Google spreadsheet and CRM in January 2020 to now sort of operating as Auxeris in a fully fledged form.
And before we jump into kind of the actual kind of nuts and bolts of Auxeris, what are the differences between kind of the UK recruitment market and how kind of companies use recruiting firms? Is it similar or different than maybe the US and how they think about recruitment firms?
So I think the US are quite heavily reliant on staffing companies, so a lot more contractor. And because one of the other big things is that there is a speed component in the US market, because of course your notice periods are so restrictive. So you're often turning around in 2 weeks, whereas in the UK, regularly the basic would be a month, but you're regularly in sort of high power jobs looking at 3 months or 6 month notice periods. Interestingly, in the UK, it's about 25 to 26% of companies that use recruitment companies in any sort of form of permanent hiring. And I think one of the big kind of differences in the US and the UK is that the UK market is very old school. It's very sort of archaic in the way that it operates, whether it be the actual industry itself or the way that people hire. Whereas, of course, in the US, there's a lot more innovation around and a lot more tolerance to new technologies and new ways of doing hiring. So, yeah, I think it is. There certainly is a difference, but actually, as a sort of breeding ground for building a business, the UK is ripe for opportunity, and it might be about a third or 25% of the size of the US market. There is still a lot of ground to cover and area to play in.
And so how does Auxeris, or I guess, when you were starting this business and then kind of officially launching it in 2022, like what was your differentiator? Like everybody talks about, and in any business, like how do you differentiate yourself from the competition? So, maybe walk us through kind of how Auxeris works and how it differentiates from a solo kind of recruitment person.
Of course. So it's a slightly weird perspective to put on it, because our customers weirdly are the recruiters, but our end buyer is the hiring company, so the person using recruitment services. So essentially what we do is we provide technology to the individual recruiter, and that covers everything from business development, legal and financial controls, invoicing, payment processing, and then access to economies of scale tools that will support those individual recruiters to be more powerful. So that is, LinkedIn recruiter licenses, job postings, big brand reach, all of the stuff that you essentially give up when you walk out of a big company and you set up by yourself. So from that perspective, that's something that there isn't anywhere that offers that to individual recruiters without taking a chunk of equity out of their business, or forcing them to come in as on really unpreferential terms. Now, when you then take that a step further to the end buyer, so the hiring company, the big differentiator is that so the average life cycle of a recruiter is 9 months in the industry. So that means the vast majority of people who are sitting in the recruitment industry have been there out of university as graduates. They're not going to survive. They don't have the experience and they don't have the knowledge or expertise. And so when you look at a hiring company who's actually trying to get value add from what is, on the face of it, a very expensive service, you actually want to be working with people who know what they're talking about. And if you go to large recruitment companies or even try and find the one-man bands who are impossible to spot, you have no guarantee of the quality that you're getting in terms of the service. The people who are going to understand your culture, that are going to engage with your team structure, that are going to deeply understand the technological knowledge or the operational knowledge that's required in a particular role. Whereas what we do is we only take the top 1%. So it's incredibly difficult to join Auxeris because 99% of people aren't a fit for us. They don't have enough experience. They're not proven enough. They don't have the right motivations, and they're not sort of driven to utilize all of our resources to the max. And as a result, the end customer actually has the potential to tap into a pool of really, really experienced recruiters who've been doing it for 15, 20, 25 years and actually really know the candidates that are going to fit in their companies in a really intricate way.
So there's a couple things I wanted just to pull out because you said some data that I think is interesting. So you said and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but you said the average life cycle of a recruiter in the industry is 9 months. Does that mean that
Yeah.
the average recruiter in the industry only has 9 months of recruiting experience or job experience?
No, so if someone starts on day one, they walk out of university and they go in as a grad in a recruitment company, the average period of time they will survive in the recruitment industry is 9 months
Got it. Okay. So yeah,
before
it
they
is
drop out.
definitely a churn and burn type environment, especially when you go into these bigger companies. And I liked how you
Absolutely.
put it that, it's very hard to find the one man bands that have been doing it for 10, 15, 20 years, mainly because they kind of have a core list of clients that they do work with. And so they typically don't need to kind of expand their reach into the masses. As long as their core group of customers are kind of feeding them enough to make a business, assuming that they don't want to grow it to be a much larger company. And
Completely.
so I like that as a differentiator because a lot of times when I have clients, because I'm in the recruiting space, they always ask you what's your differentiator, and it's very hard to differentiate one recruiting firm to another, except for the actual recruiter that's doing the work, right? And so
Gotcha.
that's where if you go to these big firms, regardless of it's a staffing firm or an exec search firm, the person that sells you the business is typically not the person that's actually doing the actual work, right? They're punting that to a junior person that's got a year, maybe two, if that, in the industry. So I think it's an interesting kind of thing that you're almost adding a lot of firepower to these small solo 1-2 person recruiting firms to give them a little bit more reach if they so
Absolutely.
desire.
And
Um,
it's funny you say about you're dealing with these inexperienced people who are actually filling the jobs. My standard go-to line when I talk to hiring companies is pitched by a manager, managed by a consultant, delivered by a graduate. Like that's the structure that you get in a big recruitment agency. And actually, but the catch 22 with a lot of these independents is what they then have to deal with by themselves is their social media and their legal and invoicing and chasing financing and all that kind of stuff. So the risk is that when you find an independent, you might only be getting 25% of their attention
yep.
because they're running a business. And this is the real catch 22 that yes, you might get a more experienced person, but they've got to do everything else. And we're really trying to alleviate that. So you are getting 100% of these high quality recruiters' attention.
And how does it work? So if a recruiter's listening to this or how when you find that 1%, right? When they go through your vetting process, which it sounds like it's pretty intensive to make sure that you're only letting in the top 1% of, solo or small recruiting firms, how do they then go to market, right? So if they have their own brand, Justin Dixon Recruiting, and that's been something that they've had for 10 or 15 years or whatever, how do they present themselves to customers? And also how do they present themselves to their current customers? Like, do they go under Auxeris, or how does that work?
So we do have a centralized Auxeris brand, but we allow people to acknowledge that they have a separate brand. And the reason for that is that we are very transparent with our customers that our recruiters don't work for us. We are establishing a tech-enabled network. That being said, there are 160,000 registered recruitment companies worldwide. So if you have Joe
Wow.
Bloggs Recruitment, it's incredibly difficult to stand out. Now, I take a really basic example. We have a recruiter who's been in the game for 10, 12 years, and he has 372 followers on his company page on LinkedIn. We've been around and operating since 22, and we have over 11,000. And that's
Mm,
growing by about 100 a week. So, and because we have a marketing person who spends the time building that brand. So when that person then uses Auxeris as a brand to reach out, they have the visibility of the entire network and resources that can support across the entire business and all their verticals, but also they have some actual clout to what the brand is. And let's be honest, when you're talking about C-suite decision makers, they're going to want to feel that the company that they're about to sign terms with and agree to pay a chunk of change to come with a clout and reputation that is going to give them some confidence in a good service, which, to be frank, is all made up anyway. But the fact is, we still operate that way. So it's very much designed to support that kind of reputation that they're trying to build as individuals. But we also do not deny that they have their own businesses and their own relationships.
Got it. So they would, any client they get kind of through the Auxeris brand would come through as like they're like almost like an Auxeris consultant or recruiter,
Mhm.
but then they can still work with their existing
Absolutely.
relationships through their own brand. That's
Yeah.
interesting. How does the kind of, shifting, I could talk about the whole recruitment process for days, but obviously that's not the intent of this podcast. But how does it work from an economic standpoint? Because a lot of times when these types of services exist, you have to give up a chunk of your business to that firm. Like there are services similar to this in the U.S. that I've talked to and that I know exist that kind of, but they take a fairly substantial chunk of your business. Some of them require you to go under their brand, and so you have a lot of differentiators that I think are interesting. So how does it work that maybe is from an economic standpoint for the recruiters?
Yeah, so one of the big ones that we've tried to avoid is significant upfront cost for our recruiters. So whatever the services you're purchasing, even if you went and looked at everything that we've built and everything that we've put together and every partnership that we have with suppliers, if you tacked that all together, your upfront risk is fairly significant. So we've tried to avoid that. That's number one, especially if you're in the contingent space. So what we have is a very simple registration fee. It's one off, and once you're in, you're in. We offer some premium services, which you can get on a monthly subscription, but the primary one includes a full LinkedIn Recruiter Professional Services license, and that is at about between 40 and 60% discount, depending on what part of the world you're in. So that's giving you access to, let's be frank, the number one tool in the world at a significant discount. And the other thing is we don't tie you into 3-year contracts. You're on a monthly rolling contract, so that gives you a lot more freedom. And then depending on what level you're at, the maximum we would take out of a fee is 30%. But that obviously is tiered depending on what your billings are and what your subscription level is. And the reason for that is, again, we're taking obviously the financial risk. So we cover all of the services. We still pay for the licenses even if you don't use them. We provide job slots, all that kind of stuff. But again, at volume, you won't really notice it. And one of the reasons we calculated it that way was basically we totted up how much, if someone comes to you and says, I want you to hire this person, how much has it costed you to run your website, your email address, post your job, use your CRM, use your ATS, spend your time vetting the applicants, and then obviously submitting the job. And if you then take that out as a percentage of the fee, your net margin on most fees is going to be around 60 to 70%. The only difference is you've got to outlay the cash and you might not make any of the money.
Mm-hmm.
So our economic model is we'll take roughly the same amount, but if you're not successful, we're not successful.
Right. Yeah. I've always thought about it as, somebody brings me a client, if I don't have to do work for that client and I can just do what I love to do. And that's what a lot of solo recruiters are in business to do, is not to be a business development person. They're in to help companies find the right talent. Right. And so, if I can be fed, Rex jobs like I almost am as a corporate recruiter, and I can just do what I do best, that's kind of the best of both worlds. And a 30% fee on top or out of that fee is not that big of a deal, because I don't have to spend my time, money, or effort getting that client, right? And
Yeah.
so I think there's a lot of value in that, because I know a ton of solo or small recruitment firms that ebb and flow by their ability to bring in new business, because you have to, especially in contingent, you don't get paid unless you fill that job, right? And so you have this catch 22 of, I need to go generate business, but then I have to fill that business in order to get paid. So if you can kind of be the continuous kind of filling the top of the funnel, and I can say, hey, I'm full, like I don't need any more positions. But then I say, hey, I'm open. I need more opportunities. Obviously there's an opportunity for you to come in and help fill that.
Absolutely. And on top of that, if you're sitting there going, well, actually, I've got too many jobs for my client. Well, don't worry. We've got John and Sarah and Kate who can help you out, and you can do a fee split.
Yeah.
So on top of that, you've got that resource of so much scope in terms of scaling what you build without ever having to, really leave your kitchen table if you don't want to.
Yeah. And it sounds like with that model of having kind of, hey, I'm full, but one of my clients that I got through you needs more positions, I can then tap into the other resources within Auxeris and almost build a little pseudo firm that, hey, I'll fee split this with you. And, it's, so that's very interesting. What regions of the world are you in right now?
Oh God, a long list. So we started in the UK. We are creeping our way across Europe. So we currently have clients in Germany, France, Switzerland, Spain, Italy. We've just got our first few recruiters in Scandinavia.
Hmm.
We've also just landed our first recruiter in Australia, slightly by accident, but she's just wonderful. So we wanted her on board. And then South Africa, we do have clients in Canada and the US, but we haven't actively sought recruiters there. We're open to it, but we're not spending a lot of time on sales and kind of growth in the US at the moment, simply because, as I said, it's a very large market, and one wants to be well positioned to accommodate people there. But I suspect it won't be much more than 4-6 months before we're very much operating in the US.
Yeah, I was going to ask. So this sounds like an interesting model, and obviously the U.S. is a large and very fragmented, recruiting business and industry, and so I think there could be a lot of scale in the U.S. What is kind of the growth plan for Auxeris? Like, and how big are you now as far as like people, and where do you think you're gonna get to kind of as we move into 2025?
Yeah, so I mean, our next goal as a business is to raise a venture capital round. As you, I'm sure, know, money makes money, and you do need to be able
Mm-hmm.
to spend some cash. So that's kind of our first step. And one of the relationships we're looking at is specifically a US VC firm with very very direct experience in the recruitment industry. From my perspective, from a growth plan perspective, I would quite like to be strategic about where we expand in the US, because the US is as big as Europe in terms of scale, but also in terms of diversity, whether it's from state by state variations in employment regulations, or just attitudes to salaries or hiring trends, or any of those kind of things. So I think our next step will be looking at where are we targeting in terms of regional areas in the US, rather than treating it like one big pie, just being like, well, we're going to focus on this specific area. And whether that's East Coast or West Coast, I mean, my instinct is from a time zone and sleep perspective, East Coast is easier. But whether or not it'll be strategically the right place, I'm not sure. And the same applies in places like Canada. And I mean, actually, we've got one recruiter who's interested in the East Asian markets.
Mm.
So, the risk is I might not find any time in 24 hours to be asleep if we go too fast. So one just has to be a bit strategic about that. But again, the same applies in Europe.
Well, I don't want to advocate for any specific region of the U.S., but Texas, I hear, is great. So,
You might
not
be
opposed to
biased.
you. Yeah, not opposed to you starting there. May have a client. And then I guess as a from a business perspective, right? So, how did it feel, or what did you have to learn as you've scaled your business? Because obviously, it sounds like it's been successful. You're starting to now. You've raised a friends and family initially. Being a small business owner is much different than a scaling business owner, where you have to be more strategic. You're not as involved in some of the day-to-day things that you may have enjoyed doing earlier in your business career. And now you've got people that are doing things that you usually would be more in control of. So how did you have to think about kind of the evolution of going from a smaller business owner to a growing business owner, and having people doing the things, like I said, that maybe you used to do and kind of wanted control over, and now you don't have as much?
I mean, to call it an existential crisis is probably not an understatement. I think, from my perspective, it was a very big shift, and the reason for that is that I am, I can turn my hand to pretty much anything, and I don't say that in some sort of airy fairy arrogant way. I just mean in the sense that I'm interested in a lot of things, and I have a technical ability, and I can also converse with people. So there wasn't much the business that I didn't get involved in. That being said, I was very strategic about the way that I hired. So I am the youngest person in the company, bar one of our junior developers, and two of the people that I work with were bosses of mine. So
Mm.
if I was going to be able to relinquish the control and the sense of kind of autonomy and all that kind of stuff, I was going to need to put it into hands of people that I really, really trusted. And that will become less and less the case as we continue to grow. But this kind of first, what I would have called the SLT, it's not an SLT at the moment because I don't necessarily have a team underneath them, but the SLT of the future I needed to trust that they had a very similar vision, but also had a very similar mindset to the way that I wanted to grow the business and how I want to operate as a business. So yeah, that was a very, very big transition. But I do think the ultimate thing, if whenever you're building a business in this way, it is about making sure that you trust the people. You don't want to be sitting there saying, yes, you take over that part of the business, but by the way, I'm going to look over your shoulder for the next 6 months.
Yeah.
That's not a viable option. But that being said, seeing notifications come in of new recruiters and new clients and new roles and new deployments on the tech platform and just thinking I haven't touched that is quite an uncomfortable feeling.
Yeah, it's you're kind of you kind of birthed the baby and now somebody else is kind of taking care of it, and so now you've got to be okay with that a little bit, especially as you want to scale. Um, Pivoting a little bit to kind of the AI world, and you can't talk about recruitment without talking about AI, and you can't really talk about any kind of business without talking about AI. How do you use AI in Auxeris, and then broadly, what are you seeing from an AI perspective in recruitment? Because I've been in the industry for 18 years, and pretty much since I started, I was told that tech was going to replace me, in 2 years, and that's been consistent for the last 18 and hasn't yet. But there are things that are being more efficient from a recruiting process using technology. But how are you guys using it at Auxeris, and what are you seeing kind of more broadly as a trend?
Yeah. So if you think about the kind of entire life cycle of running a recruitment business, we're using it in some ways that do feed into the recruitment process, but not necessarily in the ways that you would think. So, for example, we use it for lead generation and lead matching. So when we're helping people source new clients and build client relationships, we use a lot of matching within AI to do that. We also do it for a lot of content creation in generic email communication. So anything that is ostensibly a waste of a recruiter's time, we try and alleviate by using AI. We use it for matching roles. So when we have a role that has a particular requirement and we want to understand whether someone's going to have the specific knowledge to be able to support that and fill that, then we use it there. We're in the process of rolling out sort of AI generated profiles. So using a kind of enclosed AI program to take a CV and make it standardized and remove all of the potential triggers for bias and that sort of thing. And that's a really big one for us. And the other one is constructing things like Boolean search programs and stuff. So again, it's about streamlining the boring parts of recruitment. I fundamentally do not agree with the idea that AI is going to replace recruiters. And there is two very simple reasons for that. One is we are currently operating a lot of these AIs on archaic hiring data, which is why 18 months ago, 2 years ago, Amazon shut down their AI for hiring. Why? Because if you feed in 15 years of data that says white American men have built this business, the AI will think they need to hire more. And that is going to, again, fundamentally undermine the advances that we're looking for in the way that we hire. And that's also replicated not only in the multitude of lawsuits that are coming out in terms of companies that have used AI in hiring processes, but also as of end of March this year, I found 4,800 academic papers on biases in hiring in AI just published in the UK. So
Got it.
we know there's a problem. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a scenario in which candidate sourcing can be AI-ified in the future, but I do think we have misunderstood what it is to build an AI on solid data foundations. And we've assumed that humans created good data over the last 50 years. Oddly enough, I don't think we have. So that's number one. And number two, and this is a really big thing for us, and it's the way our system operates is very much about building relationships and using technology to enable that. And that is that I don't believe there will come a time for many, many years when an AI can shake a person's hand and know instantly that they're not going to get on with the manager or the CEO, or they're not going to fit in the company and they'll be gone in 6 months. That person to person relationship is so nuanced that I genuinely don't believe that AI will be able to ever take away that little bit. And I think a lot of technology at the moment that's being pitched is trying to get rid of that. And I think that's the true value add of a good recruiter. So I don't believe that it's going to to have a significant impact in terms of eradicating recruiters. What I do think will happen is that a huge number of people in the industry will be at risk of getting left behind if they don't understand where technology and like AI can dramatically improve the performance of the service that they provide. And that, again, is something that's a really big thing for us, that when you look at, 83% of the recruitment industry is one-man bands of companies under 5, they don't have huge tech teams that are, spending their time building AI models and, working on new technologies. Well, actually, let us be that. We will be the people that go out and find the new technologies and build the new technologies that are going to allow you to continue to compete as technology filters its way into the industry.
Yeah, I think it was very well said that I think the AI is not a replacement of, but I think it is an enhancement of recruiters in this iteration. I think, who the heck knows what's going to happen in 5-10 years. Because AI has only been around truly for the masses for a handful of years, right? So, but I think to your point, especially in very senior leadership roles, they don't trust AI enough yet to choose their next CEO or CFO or anything like that. I think some of the lower level, more high volume roles, I think their AI will be more a part of that recruitment process. Rightly or wrongly. But yeah, I think the relationship and kind of the hands-onness of a person versus AI is definitely still highly sought after, especially in specific areas.
We also assume that there is a perpetuation of improvement. This is the extraordinary thing. We've got 8 billion people on the planet, and together we are collectively kind of crap, excuse my language. And so the idea that we've managed to behave in a particular way that is going to build a perpetually improving AI, which again has been disproven. I mean, it was reported only 9 months ago that OpenAI were worried about ChatGPT 5 because they were concerned that it had too much human influence and therefore was getting dumber.
Well, that's for somebody else to figure out. I'm not smart enough to know or how to build an AI model and all of that. I'll let somebody else figure that out, and I'll let Auxeris kind of deal with how it interacts with the recruiting world. So that makes sense. As we kind of like wind this down a little bit here, let's talk a little bit about the business a little bit more, and maybe think about if we record another episode. We're recording this kind of mid-December 2024. If we recorded a podcast a year from now, where do you think Auxeris is at that point from a business and expansion perspective?
So in my mind, we are established to some degree in the US, so probably feet on the ground internally and a solid growing number of recruiters. I would like 500 active recruiters globally, so fully onboarded, fully billing, doing their thing. From a technological perspective, I would like to have scaled out our tech team in quite a significant way, so that we are able to integrate more new technologies and build better relationships. And I mean, my goal at the moment is to make sure that I'm not the linchpin to everything. And that's very much been quite an aggressive transition over the last 6 months. But by the time I get to the end of next year, to have an SLT and a board and a group of people who really essentially can do, I don't know if you know the story of the founder of Go Cardless, but he got hit by a car whilst he was cycling. Got hit by a car and ended up in hospital and was not basically out of the business for like 7 months. And as you will know, Go Cardless has gone from strength to strength. And that was because as a unit, they were so well equipped to step into the breach when he was just taken out completely for that period of time. And to build a business that is not integrally orientated around me and can actually stand on its own 2 feet without me, and do good as well. That's the other thing. Ultimately, to have enough of an impact to make, hiring processes better, fairer, more reasonable, more considerate. That's ultimately where I want to go. So, I suppose that would be the goal for. It's not a small amount to do in a year, but
Yeah, well, you're a busy person. I'm sure you can fit it all into your schedule. What about the as you expand kind of this recruitment number globally, what are you seeing as far as types of positions that are more abundant on your coming through your clients? Like, what are you typically seeing as far as recs positions that are coming through? Are they really high volume, like kind of low skill, high volume type roles, or are they, executive search? Like, where does that kind of range in your business?
So our sweet spot is probably between 40 and 80,000 pounds a year. So what would
Okay.
that be in dollars? 60 to 100 ish.
Something like that. Yeah, I don't know the
So we're
conversion.
not looking at, we're not looking at hiring 100, warehouse workers. That's not
Yep.
and again, it's not necessarily the sweet spot for a recruiter anyway. We tend to stay away from executive search generally, not because we don't want to do it, but because I think there really is, certainly in the UK, there's still that systemic little black book relationship industry, and I think it is probably the part of the industry that is least impacted by new technologies because it is still handshakes who you know. On top of that, it only represents 5% of the global revenue in the recruitment industry. So, small fry compared to everything else. So yeah, really that kind of mid-market, certainly skilled, but
Yep.
mid-market. And then when you're looking at technical roles, obviously you're looking at slightly higher rates that might not sit in executive search, but are slightly more valuable. But yeah, certainly very few. We actually do very few, very high volume, very low value roles.
Yeah, I would say that probably makes sense. I think to your point, exec search is still that handshake. You have to know the relationships and all of that, especially as you get into bigger companies. And that's another question, I guess, a little bit. What kind of companies are you typically getting brought onto the platform? Are they small to mid market themselves? Are they small or enterprise? Like what are you seeing?
Honestly, it's a complete mix. So, I mean, we've had discussions with, giant multinationals. We're currently working with a huge multinational business that's just been acquired by an even huger American business. I don't think huger is a word, but we're going to use it.
We'll use it. We'll allow it.
All the way down to, 5-person startup and they're doing their first BD hire. So complete mix. One of the big things for us as well, and this again ties back to your question about brand. PSLs obviously are incredibly restrictive for one-man bands. Very difficult to get in the room with the big companies. We've started signing PSLs this year, and
PSLs. What are PSLs?
Apologies, preferred suppliers lists.
Oh, got it. Okay. So that's more of a vendor list here in the US, RFPs and things like that. Got it.
Exactly. And if you're a one-man band, it's incredibly difficult to get on one, especially if you can only service a small part of their business or a small number of their roles. So ultimately, we'd really like to be working with the big hitters. I mean, we're in discussions with a $1.5 billion a year fintech firm. The recruiter who brought them to us, there's no way in hell that he can work with them one-on-one, which is why he brought them to us. So yes, ultimately we would like to have a lot more really large companies, but they are a pain. So, it's catch-22.
Yeah. Working in a large recruiting firm early in my career, we had a specific team that was dedicated to landing big global accounts because the sales cycle is super long. You've got to wait for the RFP and all that fun stuff. So the fact that you guys are doing that, it's very, very, very difficult and time consuming to get onto a vendor list in the US for sure. So that's awesome. You guys are doing that. Anyone, I guess, what advice would you give somebody that may be listening that is, maybe in a situation where they've thought about a business or an industry that they'd like to build a business in, what kind of advice would you give them to kind of, get started or take the leap or kind of how would you kind of give them advice to kind of, take that next step into, leaving maybe their corporate job and starting their own gig?
Yeah. So, first step, research. A lot of the assumptions I had before I started were completely poo-pooed by the actual industry. So went out and really talked to people. And again, I think a lot of people, when they start and they come up with an idea, A, they're very protective, and B, they think they know. Don't be too protective and don't assume you know. So go out and ask questions. I talked to God knows how many recruiters before I got anywhere near even quitting my job and going into becoming a recruiter, because I wanted to understand the industry. And that leads into the kind of component of make sure there is actually a a problem, because if you're going to build a business that solves a problem, what a lot of people do is they build a solution and then they try and find the problem, and that is the wrong way around. And the third thing I would recommend is, excuse my French in terms of the metaphor, but do it quick and dirty and cheap. Like, that's so
Bootstrap.
when we first launched in 22, we had a Google spreadsheet and a CRM, and that was it. And the first recruiter who joined us is actually now works part-time internally because he's so good. So we brought him in, but he still works with us. And they were incredibly patient. If they believe in your vision, they will be patient as you build the product. Whatever you do, do not go and spend $50, $100, $150,000, pounds, whichever, building a product before you know if anyone's going to use it. And the number of times I come across people where they're like, I've had this brilliant idea and we've started wireframing. And I'm like, no, just.
Have you talked to anybody about it yet? Do you know if it exists yet? Like,
That's the thing. And a lot of things, so a lot of ideas, you can create very basic, jot forms, Instagram accounts, to see what the engagement is and to see if there are potential customers. And as I say, a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking they have to build the entire product before they launch it. And that is, to be frank, rubbish. You can put the most shoddy thing out there and you'll work out pretty quick if you've got an idea that will work, because they'll still be with you 3 years later when you no longer have a Google spreadsheet and a CRM.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, let's round this out. I will end the podcast how I end every podcast, with a 3-pack of questions that I ask every guest. Question number 1 is, what is an influential business book that you would recommend?
Well, so when you first said this, you said influential book.
It can be any book. Yeah, it can be any book, because we've had people recommend like more mindset books or books that kind of, anything. Yeah.
Well, so I recently read a mindset book that is by a comedian who you may have heard of called Ruby Wax. The book is called Frazzled. And the reason it's influential, is because she's very funny. And that for me is, I like reading stuff that's engaging. But on top of that, she went and did a master's in neuroscience before she wrote the book.
Interesting.
So having been an incredibly volatile person in terms of her mental state and mental health, and overworking and getting burnout and depression and all this kind of stuff, she then did probably what I would do in the future, which is go and get a degree so that you really understand it. And then she wrote this book, and it's very, 50% of it is incredibly lighthearted and full of her debaucherous and badly behaved stories. And 50% of it is sound scientific sort of breakdowns of why you do things and how you behave. And it's not it's like a short little book, but it is, I really enjoyed it in terms of, getting the nerdy insight that I need, but also just having that kind of sense of empathy from someone who clearly worked incredibly hard to build her career.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. I hadn't heard of that, but I will definitely check that out. All right. What is your favorite thing to do outside of the office?
Play poker. That is, no, actually, now that I'm very recently engaged, I should say spend time with my fiance, but it's not. It's definitely play poker. Though for clarification, if you have not done it and you are in your 30s, I describe it like smoking. If you've got that far without trying it, don't try it now. It's a bad idea. But that's my go-to.
And you're not a novice. You are a very well-traveled and almost professional, semi-professional. I don't know if there's rankings in poker, but you're pretty good, I think. Right?
I'm definitely getting there. I started playing when I was 19, so I have been playing for a while, and I went through my phase of a good few years where I was awful at it. But I've done my 10,000 hours. I've done my million hands of poker. And I also had the good fortune that during COVID, obviously having walked into the recruitment industry, I decided I was not going to fight with the industry or with the pandemic. So instead spent 2 years just playing poker. So yes, I am competent. I would be lying if I didn't say that poker hadn't occasionally paid my mortgage. But it's taken a long time and a lot of hours to get to the point where I can comfortably sit at most tables and feel that I can hold my own.
Very cool. Last question here. What is your favorite vacation spot?
It's not necessarily a good question to ask me because I booked 1 4-day holiday in 9 years during my 20s. So I
Maybe your
think,
favorite getaway just to clear your head, and could be a park or anything like that.
I mean, ironically, it's still going to be related to poker, and the reason for that is actually it's forced complete distraction, and anything I can do that allows me to do that, and I suspect, I mean, I'm going skiing in March for the first time in about 15 years, and I suspect it will have the same effect. So I think anything that is intellectually engaging or behaviorally engaging, I can't go and sit on a sunbed somewhere. I just get driven absolutely mad. So anywhere that I can go that allows me to be fully distracted and really switch off. That's again a misnomer. It's not switch off. Switch on to something else.
Yeah. Full focus is on something else
That's
other than the myriad of things that you have to do as a business owner and run a business and all that stuff. So
I mean, it's my least favorite time is 3 o'clock in the morning because I have nothing to distract me, and it is I think that's anything.
Typically, sleep is what should distract you, I think.
I know, I'm bad at that too. Bad at holidays, bad at sleep. So I don't know how much advice anyone should ever take from me.
Well, we'll take selectively. I think the sleep would be maybe something they should not take advice. But when you're building a business, sometimes there are sacrifices that you have to make, right? And
absolutely.
Louisa, this has been an awesome conversation. If people want to learn about you and Auxeris and get in touch with you, what's the best way to connect?
LinkedIn is always the best. There are only 2 Louisa Plints in the world, and the other one's based in Australia. So if that's the
you
location,
got a 50-50
then
shot.
you've got the wrong one. But yeah, that's always the best shout because I'm always on there. Obviously, I work in the recruitment industry, and obviously you can find information about Auxeris at www.auxeris.com. And there is obviously some contact information there as well. So
awesome.
Always welcome.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the time. This has been awesome to learn about you and your business. And appreciate you being on the podcast.
It's been my absolute pleasure. And as I say, it's always nice to talk to someone who understands the space I'm in.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I hope you found at least one actionable insight from this episode of the Growth Capital Podcast, your one-stop shop for insights from private equity leaders, CEOs, and startup entrepreneurs on starting, investing in, and scaling successful businesses, as well as the role having the right talent plays in growing a successful business. It would be greatly appreciated if you would rate and review this podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe and drop us a comment so we can expand the audience of this podcast. Thank you for all your support, and don't forget about upcoming episodes dropping every Tuesday.